Okay, so we are now studying political revolutions. This is a really quick crash course about the political revolutions. You are following along with your worksheet, or you are taking Cornell notes, depending on the directions I have given you. Like I said, we're going to go through this quickly so that we can move on to the Industrial Revolution. And while I'm going through the slides quickly, don't forget that you are able to pause the video whenever you need to in order to write information down. So, the essential question for this unit is how were political revolutions during the 1700s and 1800s similar as well as different from each other? So, by the mid 1700s, what type of major social change was about to occur? Revolution, of course. Okay. The image on this slide is a battle and revolt taking place in the during the French Revolution. So major aims of the revolutions of the late 18th century, remember 18th century would be the 1700s, would have been freedom, then the right of the people to make their own decisions, and then self-rule from foreign powers. Painting off to the right is again about the French Revolution. It's supposed to be Lady Liberty, essentially, that's at the center of the photo. A lot of famous works of art about revolutions were made during the French Revolution or shortly thereafter. What challenges did revolutionaries face during this period? A lot of the challenges came down to that the rulers weren't willing to share their power. Okay. Many of the governments had a parliament that we've discussed before, but the king was not letting parliament uh, oversee their part of the government like they were supposed to. Another challenge would have been that there was no guarantee what type of government would result from a revolution. This happened with France, even though France had their revolution. They ended up having quite a bit of power struggles throughout as well as afterwards. And then eventually, Napoleon took power from the revolutionaries and formed a new version of the monarchy with his emperorship. Okay, so now we're moving on to the Enlightenment and Revolution. So, what was the political situation in Europe when the Enlightenment began, and how did the influence of religion have on the government? So, at the time that the Enlightenment period emerged, Europe was being governed by authoritarian institutions and rulers. Basically, that's just referring to the monarchs, okay, the kings and queens, or the czars like Ivan the Terrible. Monarchs justified their authoritarian rule, having that absolute power, by claiming that they ruled by divine right or authority from God. This should be familiar to you from Unit 1. Remember that the king, especially King James the First of England, often used Bible quotes um, to say that he had the same kind of authority as God. Kings and queens would compare their authority to God with how they could give life, they could choose who could would live and who would die. They could give blessings such as property and riches, and they could also take that away. So, how did ancient Greek and Roman philosophy inspire the Enlightenment? From your timeline activity, you should remember that Athens was a direct democracy, which means that the people get to vote directly on issues and laws. Rome, ancient Rome, was a representative democracy, so the people vote for others to represent them in the government, and then it's those representatives that make the final decisions and do most of the voting and lawmaking. So both ancient Athens or ancient Greece and ancient Rome inspired revolutionaries to challenge monarchies and their other forms of authoritarian rule by having those democratic examples. Philosophers use their knowledge of ancient democracies to develop their own ideas about how governments should be formed, as well as how people should be ruled. So, what is the relationship between natural law and human laws? Natural law is the idea that there are laws beyond human laws. There is a set of moral principles that can be applied and often should be applied to any culture or system of justice. In other words, everyone has a natural sense of what is good and what is evil and how good should be done and evil should be avoided. It's often referred to as human nature instead of natural law. And it's what directs our conscience if we have to make a choice or reason in a situation about right or wrong. Now, many philosophers believe that human laws often violate natural law and that often human laws are wrong and need to be changed. Human laws are just everyday rules that govern our lives from the legal system. Um, at one end, right down to saying, such as, if there's a sign, wet paint, don't touch. Okay, that's a human law. But the philosophers believe that many of these human laws were corrupted, okay, especially when it came to the monarch's absolute power. Philosophers' ideas of the social contract. We're going to go over three different philosophers. If you worked on Unit 2, some of these should be familiar to you, as well as from your timeline activity in Unit 3. So the first philosopher we're looking at is Thomas Hobbes. Okay, the man right off to the right. This is part of the book cover of his very famous book called The Leviathan. So Hobbes believed that people give up some of their freedom by agreeing to obey an absolute ruler. In return, the ruler is agreeing to bring peace and order to society. Next, we have John Locke. So he thinks that the social contract is conditional. Okay. So if the ruler fails to protect the people's lives, their liberty, or their property, then the people have the right to overthrow that ruler. And once they've overthrown them, they can establish a new government. Jean Jacques Rousseau, okay, a Frenchman, he believed that governments are formed by a social contract, are based on popular sovereignty. So remember, the power comes from the people. If the government acts against the general will of the people, then it's breaking the social contract, and that government should be dissolved, meaning that they should get rid of that government, similar to how Locke thought. Okay, so next we're going over the American Revolution. So, what kind of led to the American Revolution? Basically, the British passed a bunch of different tax laws that the people of the colonies were not happy about, especially the wealthier citizens, those who were kind of running the government or dealing with a lot of trade and business internationally. They were very upset with the different taxes. So one of the big tax laws that was started was the Stamp Act in 1765. But why did the British pass it to begin with? First of all, they needed to raise money, revenue, to defend the colonies, and they were mostly focused on raising money to protect the colonies against attacks by Native Americans or Indians. There was a lot of taxes that also needed to be done after the French and Indian War. So the British government wanted the colonies to pay for their own defense or protection. The colonists, however, were not happy about this. They were outraged. Uh, in reaction to the Stamp Act of 1765, colonists formed actually a secret organization, and it was called the Sons of Liberty, in order to protest the Stamp Act. And this opposition against the Stamp Act actually ended up helping to unite the colonies in the long run. So right here, this red stamp, that would be an example of what the stamp looked like. The stamp was placed on any sort of paper product. Okay, anything from parchment paper, books, playing cards, even games such as dice, all kinds of stuff could have the stamp placed on it as a requirement once you purchased it. Off to the right, we have an example of essentially a protest version of the stamp, a little political cartoon. Death, okay, skull and crossbones, not a pleasant symbol. So, why did the colonists find the intolerable act so threatening? So, the intolerable acts was actually a series of laws that the British created in response to the British Tea Party, or sorry, to the Boston Tea Party. So, when the colonists, in protest of the Tea Act, threw a whole bunch of tea into the Boston Harbor to punish the colonists, the British made the Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts. So they were a series of acts. One, they closed the Boston Harbor to any sort of trade, which is really going to affect the colonists' money and income. And they also, part of that act is the Quartering Act, where they force colonists to allow soldiers onto their property and into their homes, and they had to help take care of the soldiers. So they what the colonists found so threatening is that it showed that the British wanted to exert more control over the colonies, which the colonists were very concerned about. They also feared that the British would take away self government from the colonies and that they would not have the political freedom that they traditionally had had in the past. Purpose of the First Continental Congress. So, the purpose of the First Continental Congress was to unite the colonies to present their complaints to the British in a unified way. They hoped that by uniting the colonies, they would have more power in order to negotiate. This is a very famous political cartoon from that era. The letters are meant to represent the different colonies. We have um, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and New England. Okay. And see, it's a snake. And if you cut the snake up, the different colonies, the snake's going to die. But if the colonies join together, then they will be strong and keep living and eventually win, was kind of the premise of the cartoon. So, key events that you need to add to your timeline in your notes. So, May 1775 was the battles of Lexington and Concord, one of the first battles of the American Revolution. And essentially, the British were going to seize weapons from the colonists, and the colonists reacted and tried to prevent that from happening. And then a battle ended up taking place. Next, we have July 1776. The Declaration of Independence is issued by the Continental Congress. Excuse the little typo there. So, the Declaration of Independence is when we officially declare our separation from Great Britain. Basically, it's a long letter saying that this is what's been happening to us. We tried to talk to you about it. We tried to fix it with you, but these are all the horrible things that you've done to us in the colonies. Therefore, we have to separate from you. September 1776, New York City is captured by the British. December 1776, the British are defeated by George Washington at Trenton, New Jersey. October 1782, the British surrender at Yorktown. And then in 1783, there's the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which officially ends the war between our countries, as well as with our allies, France, who helped us fight against the British. So, if you were to look at the battles of the American Revolution, the British actually won quite a few of them, if not most of them, but the colonists won the ones that really counted, that really made a big difference in the war, which is ultimately what helped us win. Another reason why the colonists won is that they were motivated, very, very motivated. They were fighting on their own land as well. They knew the resources that they had available to them. They used guerrilla warfare tactics, and that really gave them an advantage over the British. The British, they just wanted to go home. So, major issues and solutions reached at the Constitutional Convention. So, before we had our official US Constitution, we had what was called the Articles of Confederation. It was our first constitution, so we've actually have had two in the history of the United States. But the Articles of Confederation, often referred to as the AOC, were very, very weak. It really did not give our federal government much power, and because of that, our federal government was not effective. So, from the Articles of Confederation, they wanted to fix it in order to have a stronger, effective constitution. Now, some of the issues they were dealing with at this constitutional convention was determining whether representation in Congress should be based on the population of a state or if it should be divided equally among all the states. Deciding whether or how enslaved people would be counted towards a state's population. They also looked at strengthening the weak central government established under the Articles of Confederation. Some examples of those weaknesses would be that the federal government could not collect any taxes, they could only request that states pay money. We did not have a army, we did not have the ability to draft for the army. No post office, things like that. So, solutions. The Great Compromise made representation in the House based on population. So, that's referring to the House of Representatives in Congress. But as part of that compromise, they also gave each state the same number of representatives in the Senate. So, two senators for each state. So, we have population and the number of states being represented. They came up with a compromise for the enslaved population. So each enslaved person was counted as three-fifths of a person. This is known as the three-fifths compromise. The Constitution created a more powerful central government, also known as federal or national government, and serves as the supreme law of the land and applies to all states and all citizens. Now we're going to look at revolutions in France. So, part of what was leading to a lot of the bad feelings towards the beginning of the revolution was the different social divides that were present in France. So, in the 1700s and prior to that, the French people were divided socially into what's called the three estates. These three estates were considered legal categories of groups of people. So the first estate consisted of the clergy, which would be this gentleman on the left. The second estate is consisted of the nobility, which would have also included knights, which accounts for his costuming. And then everyone else was in the third estate. Now, the commoner class made up around 95% of the total population in France. The third estate included even merchants and doctors and lawyers, salesmen, tradesmen, but it also included the poor and working farmer. We kind of looked at these three estates just in general when you looked at the boxes that we had with our first unit of stations. So Louis XVI summons the Estates General. Now, this proved to be a big mistake for King Louis. The summoning of the Estates General was disastrous for his monarchy because it gave commoners access to power. The Estates General had not met prior to that in more than 170 years. Representatives of the Third Estate came prepared to discuss their grievances uh, and their ideas about liberty, about government based on natural law. As a result, the Estates General declared themselves as a national assembly with the power to govern France, and they began writing a constitution. They actually began writing a declaration in the tennis court uh, on the castle grounds. The king's attempts to stop the assembly from meeting angered the people of Paris, who ended up rebelling. So there's three different major stations of revolution. The first stage is the National Assembly. Within this stage, they write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, where all men gained equal rights. Now, note, women are not being counted here yet. France became a constitutional monarchy. Feudalism was abolished. Feudalism was the power between the nobility and their serfs which were practically like slaves in the countryside who worked for the nobility by farming their land. And then France also went to war with Austria and Prussia. So France had to go to war with Austria and Prussia because the other neighboring European countries were threatened by the idea that the people had removed their king and queen from power. The second stage of the revolution is known as the convention. This is where extremist politicians gained control of the government, and what is known as the Reign of Terror began. The monarchy was abolished, they got rid of it, and King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette were beheaded by the guillotine. This painting is a reproduction of the beheading of King Louis XVI. The final stage of the revolution is known as Napoleon. So, Napoleon was a relatively common man who worked his way up through the military to a higher rank, gained a lot of popular support by his soldiers that served under him. And with his popularity and military cunningness, basically, ended up seizing control of France in a coup and ruled as a dictator. Under his rule, he created the Napoleonic Codes. With part of these codes, he made it a lot more equal for men of all classes. He made it where you didn't have to be born into a job. You got jobs based on your merit, which was a pretty good positive. However, with these Napoleonic codes, he also really took a lot of rights and basic protections away from women. Um, Basically, men were the protectors and guardians of women. Um, they said what women could do and not do, and it also made it a lot harder for women to get a divorce if they were in a dangerous situation. Napoleon ends up crowning himself not just the dictator of France, but as emperor of the Empire of France, and his armies dominate much of the European country. So, how did the French Revolution inspire events elsewhere in Europe? The French Revolution manages to spread the ideals of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty, so that's rule by the will of the people throughout Europe. Europeans also challenged the authority of monarchies and sought to replace them with republics. Now, the next revolution that the French Revolution is actually going to go on to inspire is called the Haitian Revolution. You're going to learn about that in a moment. So, revolutions in Latin America. So, there was a French colony called Saint Dominique, and it ends up becoming the first Black republic. So, republic, remember, is democratic in modern history. So in 1791, inspired by the French Revolution directly, slaves in the French colony of Saint Dominique revolted. These rebels were led by Toussaint Louverture. They succeeded in taking over the colony and they drove the French troops out to suppress the revolt. And in 1804, they declared themselves independent and founded the first Black Republic in modern history, and they renamed themselves Haiti. I think it's kind of interesting here how they did a number of paintings making Toussaint look like Napoleon, a very similar style of painting that you saw earlier in the PowerPoint. What's interesting though is keep in mind that while they're inspired by the French Revolution, Saint Dominique was controlled by France and by Napoleon, so they're actually fighting Napoleon and his armies with this revolution. So, how did Napoleon's invasion and occupation of Spain affect the Spanish colonies in South America? When Napoleon occupied Spain, it severed the link between Spain and its colonies. Creoles in the colonies saw this as a good opportunity to restore their position in colonial society, which had been diminished quite a bit by Spanish policies, while some sought to free themselves entirely from Spanish rule. So they wanted to be independent. So now we're looking at the different contributions of revolutionary leaders in Latin America. So first is Toussaint Louverture with the French colony Saint Dominique, which we already said they reestablished as Haiti. He is the one leading the revolts for much of the revolution until he is killed. And he did manage to drive the French out and establish the country as Haiti. Jose de San Martin's contribution to the independence of his country is that he formed and trained a patriot army in Rio de la Plata, now known as Argentina, and defeated Spanish royalist forces in Chile and Peru. Simon Bolivar's contribution to the independence of his country is that he led the revolution against Spain in New Granada, and he joined with San Martin to defeat royalist forces in Peru. Miguel Hidalgo's contribution to the independence of his country is that he was pretty interesting. He's a radical Creole priest who inspired a nationalist uprising of both Indians and mestizos in the Mexican countryside. The Royalist army overpowered the rebel forces, though, and unfortunately, he was executed. However, with the movement that he started for independence from Spain, managed to continue after his death, and eventually the movement is successful with gaining independence in 1821. So, how did excuse me? How did Brazil's path to independence differ from the other countries that had been taken over by in South America? So Brazil did not have the same type of revolution. So it actually won its independence quite peacefully because the son of Portugal's kings responded to calls for reform from Republicans uh, and declared Brazil as independent. So once Brazil gained its independence, it initially started off with a constitutional monarchy. So the king's son, listened to the requests of the people and followed through with it, which is pretty cool. So that is the end of our PowerPoint. You should have all of your worksheets filled out. If you have any questions, make sure you ask me. and you need to ask to be assigned to the Unit 4 quiz.